Bismillah wa salatu salam ala Rasulillah. So to continue inshallah, and as I mentioned, so just to look at a particular point that we may not have looked at last week, the author rahimahullah al-Ghazali, he says, فحب الشيء لا ينقطع إلا بقهر النفس على مفارقته حتى يصير ذلك اعتيادا. So when speaking about az-zakah being a form of purification, he speaks about the idea of the purification coming from the love of something being removed from one's heart by way of removing that thing from the person, him or herself. So he says, it's a principle I guess you can apply. He says, فَحُبُّ الشَّيْءِ لَا يَنْقَطْعُ إِلَّا بِقَهْرِ النَّفْسِ عَلَى مُفَارَقَتِهِ. That the love of something is not possible except if a person forces him or herself to give up that thing that they love. And this is something which is very important. And qahru nafs in Arabic, al-qahru is something, it's like to force and to kind of, I guess you could say with an iron fist, if you like, to subdue. And so when we speak about ourselves and we think about the time that we live in a time where it's very easy to become addicted to the passions or desires that we may have, i.e. an outlet which allows us to fulfill our desires or our passions or our appetites, etc. And it's not possible to remove the love of that particular outcome except if we force ourselves to distance ourselves from it. And so in the beginning, it means it's going to be very difficult. If I love money, I have to force myself to give up money. It's difficult. If I love the interaction with the opposite gender or attention from the opposite gender, I have to force myself to give up that attention or affection or interaction and so on and so forth. And so it's difficult. There's going to be a difficulty and uncomfortability in the beginning, and that's something that we should take into consideration. Sabr, patience, is not easy. It's difficult to be patient. It's difficult to be patient. And the Prophet ﷺ, he said, إِنَّمَا الْعِلْمُ بِالتَّعَلُّمْ وَالْحِلْمُ بِالتَّحَلُّمْ. That knowledge is acquired through the action of learning, i.e. at-ta'allum. And al-hilmu, a certain character quality, is acquired through at-tahallum, through trying to acquire that quality through action, through going through the process of adorning ourselves with that quality. And so when it comes to character, it's very important to remind ourselves of this. So just to continue from where we left off and to remind ourselves, he says, المعنى الثالث شكر النعمة. So giving zakah, from the meanings of giving of zakah, is that it is a form of showing our gratitude to Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala for the blessings that He's given us. So he says, فالعبادات البدنية شكر لنعمة البدن والمالية شكر لنعمة المال. When we worship with our body, it's a form of showing our gratitude to Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala for that which we have received of physical blessings, i.e. legs, arms, eyes, and so on and so forth. Likewise, when we give our zakah, it's a form of showing Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala our gratitude for that which we have been given of wealth. Then we come to al-wadhifatul thaniya. He says, في وقت الأداء ومن آداب ذوي الدين التعجيل عن وقت الوجوب إظهارا للرغبة في الامتثال بإيصال السرور إلى قلوب الفقراء ومبادرة لعوائق الزمان أن تعوقه عن الخيرات. So he says that from the etiquettes of giving zakah is that a person, i.e. ذوي الدين, he says, the people of deen, the people of practice of Islam, those who want to be of a high standard of practice when it comes to Islam, he says that they should hasten to give the zakah prior to it becoming wajib upon them. And he says this should be done, why? To show Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala that there is a desire to follow the framework of Islam. For example, the person that comes to the salah late is not like the person that comes to the salah early. The one who comes to the salah early is showing that he is keen. There is a keenness to worship Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. Not necessarily saying the one that comes late, there is no keenness, perhaps he was delayed, etc. But if someone is consistently late to salah, that's an indication that there is an issue with the salah there. Whereas the person who is consistently early for the salah, it shows the keenness to worship Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. So likewise, he says to show that keenness to Allah, and he says بإيصال السرور إلى قلوب الفقراء. And if we marry this with what we mentioned last week or the week before, where he says that when a person gives zakah, he is sacrificing to show that he loves Allah more than anything else. Why? Because often the most beloved thing to a person after his own health is his wealth. And so when you give zakah, you're sacrificing from your wealth to show Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala, you are more beloved to me even than that which I own in my pocket or that which I possess of material and so on and so forth. And so when you marry that with this point, that the person gives his zakah as early as possible, why? To show Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala that he is keen in following the framework of Islam. There's an added meaning to it. So he says, وَبِإِيصَالِ السُّرُورِ إِلَى قُلُوبِ الْفُقَرَاءِ, and likewise to bring happiness to the hearts of the impoverished, i.e. to hasten that happiness that they feel when they receive it. وَمُبَادَرَةً لِعَوَائِقِ الزَّمَانِ أَن تَعُوقَهُ عَنِ الْخَيْرَاتِ. And one of the reasons he hastens to give zakah is just in case one of the difficulties of life prevents him from being able to give zakah in the future. So for example, I've saved now, let's say I've reached the threshold and I've saved the money, etc. If I give it quicker rather than later, I prevent myself from losing out on that money entirely and then not having the ability to give. Let's say a calamity befalls me and I have to spend all of that money now on something particular. I'm not able to give zakah from it anymore. Why? Because it's gone. So I give before that takes place. Then he says, أن تعوقه عن الخيرات وليعين لزكاته إن كان. So he goes, I mean, here we also have to add there's a point here that needs to be taken into consideration, which is it depends upon the type of zakah, number one, and whether or not there is going to be an increase. If a person knows there is going to be no increase in the amount that he has, i.e. it's zakatable and it's going to be the same in a month's time, 2 months' time, and so on and so forth, or there is a guess that there will be an increase. Is it stock? What is it that he's given zakah from? Is it livestock? And so on and so forth. So it depends on the type of zakah. Then he says, وَلْيَجْتَهِدَ أَن يَكُونَ مِنْ أَفْضَلِ الْأَوْقَاتِ لِيَكُونَ ذَلِكَ سَبَبًا لِنَمَاءِ قُرْبَتِهِ وَتَضَاعُفِ زَكَاتِهِ وَذَلِكَ كَشَهْرِ الْمُحَرَّمِ أو رَمَضَانِ. He says, likewise, when giving the zakah, a person should try to seek out the best time to give zakah. So for example, in Muharram or in Ramadan, which many people do, they give zakah in Ramadan. Why? Number one, it's easier to keep track. Because we don't follow the Hijri calendar, if you give your zakah in Ramadan, the next year, the following year, when Ramadan comes again, you know that it's time to give zakah, in case you lose track of the Hijri year. Then he says, but the main reason a person should give it in a time like Ramadan or Muharram is so that there is the possibility of his good deed being multiplied by Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. And so if I give zakah in Ramadan, inshallah, it's multiplied. If I give it in Muharram, inshallah, it's multiplied, and so on and so forth. Then he says, الوظيفة الثالثة الإصرار والإظهار فإن الإصرار أبعد عن الرياء والسمعة. قال تعالى وإن تخفوها وتؤتوها الفقراء فهو خير لكم. Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala, he says, if you give it and you give it secretly to the impoverished, then it's better for you. And Imam Ghazali, he says that in giving it publicly, there are two issues that are problematic. Number one, ar-riya. Number two, as-sum'ah. And so ar-riya is showing off physically, and as-sum'ah is showing off, but not directly. It's indirectly showing off. How so? As-sum'ah, basically, people hear about you. People hear about you. Reputation building. So people start to say, oh, he gave this amount of money, and so on and so forth. As for riya, ar-riya comes from ar-ru'ya, as-sum'ah comes from as-sama'ah. So people hear about you, as-sum'ah, people see you, ar-ru'ya, ar-riya. Then he says, وفي الحديث أو في حديث السبعة الذين يذلهم الله يوم لا ذل إلا ذله ورجل تصدق بصدقة فأخفاها حتى لا تعلم شماله ما أنفقت يمينه. So he says in the hadith of the seven that are shaded on the day wherein there is no shade except the shade of Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala, one of the individuals, the 7 people that will be shaded by Allah on Yawm al-Qiyamah, a day when the sun will be above the people's heads, is a man or a woman who gives sadaqah, but so privately and secretly that the left hand does not know what the right hand gave. And that's something which is very important. And we're going to speak about this a little bit later, inshallah. He says, وَإِذَا لَمْ يَتَمَكَّنْ إِلَّا بِأَنْ يَعْرِفَهُ شَخْصٌ وَاحِدٌ فَتَسْلِيمُهُ إِلَى وَكِيلٍ لِيُسَلِّمَ إِلَى الْمِسْكِينِ وَالْمِسْكِينُ لَا يَعْرِفُ أَوْلَى إذ في معرفة المسكين الرياء والمنة جميعا وليس في معرفة الوكيل إلا الرياء. He says, if it's not possible to avoid being known for your zakat, i.e. when you give your zakat, it's impossible to avoid someone knowing that you're giving zakat, then it's better that it's one person who knows that you're giving zakat. How? By giving it to someone to go and give it to the impoverished person, not to go and give it to the impoverished person yourself. Why? Because when you give the zakat, the charity, to the impoverished person yourself, there is ar-riya and there is sum'ah involved. Even if there is no sum'ah involved, i.e. the person keeps it private, there is something called al-minna, where you are basically giving to him, and so therefore there is a perception now perhaps that you have favor over him, whether he perceives it or you perceive it. You see yourself as having favor over this person. You see this person in the street and you remember, oh, I gave money to this person. It's not good for the heart. It's very damaging for the heart. And there are some people, subhanallah, they like to be in that position. When they give, they make sure they give it in a way which establishes that power for themselves, and they humiliate the person, and so on and so forth. And that goes against the principles of Islam. Even in the household, in some relationships, you have the man reminds the woman, I do this for you, and I do this for you, and I do this for you, and I do this for you. Or you have the opposite, the woman reminds the man, I do this, and I do this, and I do this, and I do this. And that's not correct. The Muslim does not gloat or boast, nor does he or she remind others of that which they have done for them. Why? Because it's for Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala's sake. It's not for the sake of the other person. There are times though, I think we touched upon this last time, there are times when a person may remind, remember I've done this for you. And for example with children, reminding the child, if the child is being disobedient, as your father, I clothe you, I feed you, I protect you, I this. If the child is being disobedient to the mother, your mother cares for you. Your mother, her heart breaks when you're injured. And why? To allow the child to remember the blessings so that they come back to obedience. And in doing so, you're teaching them to look at Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala in the same way. If the child learns authority, the authority of their parents, when they grow up, bi'idhnillah, they will know the authority of Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. But if the child grows up without knowing authority in the household, how are they going to respect authority outside of the household? And that's something which is very important. It's obviously a bit off topic, but the establishment of authority in a household is very, very important. And it doesn't mean that the man or the woman has to be a dictator, no, but the establishment of boundaries, principles, discipline, manners, courtesy, all of those things, they come from the parents. And today, subhanAllah, you hear children swearing at their parents, wal-'iyadhu billah. Outside the masjid, you'll hear children swearing at their parents, answering back to their parents as if they're talking to someone below them. To the extent that, subhanAllah, sometimes I've wanted to discipline the child. How dare you speak to your parent like that? And of course you can't, because it's horrific to hear. But if the parent, where does the child get it from? The child would develop this type of character if the parent allows the child to develop that character. If you allow your child to speak to you like that, the child will continue. There has to be discipline in the home. Likewise, for example, and again, it's off topic, but it's very important. And we see it in the masjid. Why? Because if you see a child that does not put their shoes away, does not hang up their coat, does not sit nicely, does not have manners with others, where is that coming from? It's coming from the home. Or a child that has no respect in the bathroom, where is it coming from? It's coming from the home. And it's our responsibility. The Prophet ﷺ, what did he say? إِنَّمَا بُعِثْتُ لِأُتَمِّمَ مَكَارِمَ الْأَخْلَاقِ. I was sent to complete good character. And so it's an important point to take into consideration. To be a parent is not just to feed and clothe the child, but to be a parent, the most important part of being a parent is to nurture the child upon principles of practice. Principles, discipline, character, etc. The food that the child eats, yes, it's beneficial, but a child who does not eat well but is raised well is much better than a child who eats well and is not raised well. The Prophet ﷺ, he was impoverished, he was poor. Many of the Sahaba, they grew up poor. and it's besides the point, but it's important for us to take into consideration. Most of the problems of our community today, perhaps, go back to a lack of parenting within our community. Most of the problems, perhaps, as you can't make a generalization, but when you look at what's happening outside, you have to ask, where are the parents? And if you go to other countries, you find this is not the case. Why? Because parents, there is a hierarchy, there is a structure. And another point to consider as well for the sisters in particular, if the sisters disrespect the man in the household, then the children will never respect the man in the household. If the wife is openly disrespecting the husband, i.e. the father, who is supposed to be the head of the household, then don't expect the children to grow up to respect the man when you want the man to come and discipline the children. It's not going to happen. The hierarchy and the structure has to be in place. It doesn't mean that the man speaks and the woman says, sam'an wa ta'ah. That's not the case. But there is a level of respect. If the man is constantly being... what's the word? I forget the word now.
Bombarded.
No, not bombarded. Undermined. If the man is constantly being undermined, then it's going to lead to the children losing respect for the man. And unfortunately, it's something that we see in many households. And again, likewise, the man should respect the woman, of course. It goes without saying. In front of the children, the man and woman should be a team. If the children are disrespecting the mother, then the husband should step in and should stop that from taking place. If the children are disrespecting the father, then the mother should step in and stop that from taking place. The Ibn al-Qayyim, rahimahullah, what did he say? He said that most of the corruption of children, of people, comes from the corruption of the parents. That's where it comes from. The way that we are raised, it's what makes us. And of course, as the famous saying goes, al-mar'u ibn asrihi. So it's not only our parents that raise us. For some of us, we're raised outside of the home just as much as we are raised inside of the home. So he says, وإذا لم يتمكن إلا بأن يعرفه شخص واحد فتسليمه إلى وكيل يسلم إلى المسكين والمسكين لا يعرف أو لا إذ في معرفة المسكين الرياء والمنة جميعا وليس في معرفة الوكيل إلا الرياء. So when you give it to the wakil, to someone to give on your behalf, i.e. the zakah, then the only issue there is ar-riya. Why? Because that person now knows you, knows how much you're giving. But when you give it to the person, the impoverished, there's the riya, i.e. showing off potentially, and the minna, that perception of now some sort of favor over the person. He says, so that's in relation to al-ikhfa. When should I protect giving my, or when should I should hide my zakah? When there is the risk of showing off and establishing some sort of authority over the other person. When though should I give my zakah in public? He says, وَيُظْهِرُ حَيْثُ يَعْلَمُ أَنَّ فِي إِظْهَارِهِ تَرْغِيبًا لِلنَّاسِ فِي الْإِقْتِدَاءِ وَيَحْرِسُ سِرَّهُ مِنْ دَاعِيَةِ الرِّيَاءِ قال تعالى إن تبدوا الصدقات فنعما هي. So he says that a person should give publicly when it leads to the encouragement of others to give publicly as well. If I am someone, I know in my community, if I give, others are going to give, then I give publicly. I don't give secretly. Why? Because I'm encouraging others. And I have to do mujahadatun nafs. I have to struggle against my soul to have ikhlas, sincerity. And then he quotes the ayah, Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala, he says, إِن تُبْدُوا الصَّدَقَاتِ فَنِعْمَ هِي. If you give in public a sadaqat, then it's good enough to be accepted by Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala, with the condition that there is sincerity in the heart. He says, وَذَلِكَ حَيْثُ يَقْتَضِيَ الْحَالَ الْإِبْدَاءِ إِمَّا لِلْإِقْتِدَاءِ وَإِمَّا لِأَنَّ السَّائِلَ إِنَّمَا سَأَلَ عَلَى مَلَئٍ مِّنَ النَّاسِ. And so it's accordance to the circumstance. If the circumstance dictates that you give publicly, then you give publicly, such as being a person who is going to lead others to give as well. Or if someone comes to you and asks you in front of people, if you cannot avoid giving, then you give. Then he says, وَقَدْ قَالَ اللَّهُ تَعَالَى وَأَنْفَقُوا مِمَّا رَزَقْنَاهُمْ سِرًّا وَعَلَانِيَةً. When speaking about the people of zakah, the people of iman, etc., Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala, he says, and they give from that which was given to them, sirran wa alaniya, publicly and secretly. So both are from the attributes of good character, of iman, of Islam. He says ندب إلى العلانية أو ندب إلى العلانية أيضا لما فيها من فائدة الترغيب فليكن العبد دقيق التأمل في وزن هذه الفائدة بالمحظور الذي فيها فإن ذلك يختلف بالأحوال والأشخاص. And so this is the important point. He says that Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala attributes giving as a quality of iman to the public giving as well as to the secret giving. Because there is benefit in giving publicly. And so the person who is giving charity needs to take into consideration and to measure what is best for the circumstance at the time. Is it best that I give publicly or is it best that I give secretly? And now here he says, and this is something that we need to reflect upon, فَإِنَّ ذَلِكَ يَخْتَلِفُ بِالْأَحْوَالِ وَالْأَشْخَاصِ. The concept, and let's make it broader here, the concept of public worship is dependent upon the circumstance and upon the individual. And so we have individuals, Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala has given them the ability to engage in public worship and it does not affect their sincerity. There are others, it is a fitna for them. They are unable to worship Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala publicly. Those individuals should stay clear away from it. What do I mean though by public worship? If we broaden the conversation, that includes praying publicly, Zakat publicly, reciting Quran publicly, Da'wah publicly, calling others to Islam publicly. For some, for example, giving a khutbah, it's not possible. Why? Because they want to be famous. They want to be famous. They're seeking fame. And fame for them is a fitna. For others, they don't care about fame. In fact, they don't want to be known and they don't even want to do the khutbah, but it's something that they have to do. So if you are the first type of person and you are sincere with yourself, and this is where we have to ask ourselves and we have to be clear with ourselves and we have to try to understand the state of our hearts. Am I seeking fame? Am I showing off? Am I seeking to be known? Do I want people to say things about me? If that's the case, then I need to stay clear of anything that is public until I am able to work on my heart. And perhaps I will never be able to work on my heart. And it's important to take this into consideration today, the day of the camera, and the day when it's very easy to become famous. It's very easy to become famous. And a person simply has to recite the Quran. A person simply has to recite the Quran with a beautiful voice, perhaps have good pronunciation, etc., and they can become famous quite quickly online. And there's an amazing quote. A non-Muslim said it, but I'm sure we can find those who have said it from amongst the ulama of the past. He said that slow progress builds character, fast, quick progress builds ego. And that's as if this person is describing our time today. How many egotistical people do we have as a result of quick overnight fame due to the internet? And if you look at the older generation of those who have been involved in da'wah and those who have been working for the sake of Islam, you don't find that they have this issue of ego. Why? Because they have been working for 20, 30, 40 years sometimes. And so it's been slow progress. Now their names may be known, but previously they weren't. Why? Because it's been a slow ascension. But if you suddenly go from nothing to everything, then it becomes very problematic. Likewise, those who come from no money and suddenly they come into some money, what usually happens? They don't know how to pace themselves. They don't know how to spend. And so they end up ruining themselves, whether it's misspending, mismanagement, addictions, and so on and so forth. And so it's important that we examine our hearts. Do I want to be famous? Do I want, for example, if I'm praying in the masjid, am I praying here because I want people to pray, to see me pray? I want it to be said I'm a person of salah. When I come to the front row, am I coming to the front row because I want people to say, oh look, mashallah, that person is always in the front row? When I'm reciting the Quran, am I reciting the Quran because I want people to say I'm a reciter and so on and so forth? It's very, very important. And look at how much emphasis Imam Ghazali rahimahullah is placing on the intention when it comes to simply giving zakat. Just zakat. And this is an abridgment of the original. Just zakat, Imam Ghazali is going into detail about the issue of sincerity or lack of sincerity, whether someone should give publicly or give privately. And so we have to examine our hearts. On Yawm al-Qiyamah, the salah will not be accepted, zakat will not be accepted, siyam will not be accepted, hajj will not be accepted, jihad will not be accepted if there is no ikhlas for Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala's sake. Imagine on Yawm al-Qiyamah, may Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala protect us and guide us. Imagine you come and all of the salawats, your entire life, you've been struggling your entire life. You've been giving charity your entire life. You've been fasting your entire life. You performed hajj multiple times and you find that it's not been accepted from you. Why? Because you are doing it for other than Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala's sake. So it's something that has to be considered. But in saying that, we don't go to the extreme. Because today there is an extreme, you can perhaps call it a religious OCD, where a person is unable to pray, unable to perform wudu, unable to engage in worship, except that they spend an hour, 2 hours, 3 hours thinking about the intention. Sometimes breaking away from the salah, starting again, breaking the salah, starting again. Wudu, I didn't do it properly, I didn't have the right intention. No, that's an extreme. That's an extreme. But it's to focus for a few seconds, as we said, and ask myself, why am I doing this? And say to myself with my heart, oh Allah, I'm doing this for your sake, accept it. And whether it's zakah, whether it's salah, whether it's siyam, whether it's hajj, whether it's jum'ah, whatever it might be. And as for da'wah today, especially for the youth, for young people, you should not be exposing yourself to the public, to the masses, until you reach an age of maturity. A young person should not be exposing himself to a camera until he reaches an age of maturity. And perhaps someone might say it's hypocritical, there's a camera right here. Perhaps. But you still have to speak about the harms of something. If I'm smoking, it doesn't mean that I'm going to tell other people it's good for you. And the camera has destroyed many people. Many young individuals have been destroyed by the camera. And so we have to be very careful with this device. Then he says, الوظيفة الرابعة عدم المن. He says, ألا يفسد صدقته بالمن والأذى. قال الله تعالى لا تبطلوا صدقاتكم بالمن والأذى. So the fourth point to take into consideration when giving zakah is that a person does not destroy their sadaqah with al-man. And what is al-man? We mentioned earlier, where a person reminds the other person, or a person holds some sort of value for themselves over the person. And he's going to give his own definition. He says, قيل المن أن يستخدمه بالعطاء والأذى أن يعيره بالفقر. So he says that al-man is basically to kind of, it's like to acquire some authority over the person by giving to them, and al-adha is to blame the person for their state, to kind of make them feel ashamed of their poverty. He says, وعندي أن أصل المن أن يرى نفسه محسنا إليه ومنعما عليه وحقه أن يرى الفقير محسنا إليه بقبول حق الله عز وجل منه. So he says, as for my opinion, i.e. Imam Ghazali rahimahullah, al-man is that he sees himself as a muhsin towards the other person, as a good doer towards the other person, and a person who has bestowed a blessing upon the other person, i.e. the recipient. He says, but the reality is that he should see the poor person has done him a favor. And the poor person is a person who has done something good to him. Why? Because he has accepted Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala's haqq from him. I.e. he has a haqq that he has to fulfill. He has a wajib that he's supposed to fulfill, and this poor person has accepted from him the zakah, therefore he has aided him in fulfilling his wajib. He says, الَّذِي هُوَ طُهْرَتُهُ وَنَجَاتُهُ مِنَ النَّارِ, which is his purification and his success from hellfire. Then he says, وَأَنَّهُ لَوْ لَمْ يَقْبَلْهُ لَبَقِيَ مُرْتَهِنًا بِهِ. And if this poor person had not accepted it from him, it would have remained a debt that he owes to Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. فَحَقُّهُ أَن يَتَقَلَّدَ مِنْهُ مِنَّةَ الْفَقِيرِ. Sorry. And so he says the person, really what they should do is to wear the minna, the virtue, the favor of the poor person around his neck like he would jewelry. To recognize that this poor person, I am in need of him, he's not in need of me. He has done me a favor, I haven't done him a favor. Then he says, وَأَمَّا الْأَذَى He says فمنبعه أمران كراهيته لرفع اليد عن المال ورؤيته أنه خير من الفقير وكلاهما منشأه الجهل. He says as for other, then it stems from the dislike of a person to let go of their wealth. Or he says that he looks at himself as better than the poor person. When I'm giving zakah to a person, I look at him as if I'm better than him. That's al-adha. Then he says, وَكَلَاهُمَا مَنْشَأُهُ الْجَهْلِ. And both of them are born from ignorance. And just to conclude, inshallah, he says, وَمَهْمَا عَرَفَ الْمَعَانِيَ الثَّلَاثَةَ الَّتِي ذَكَرْنَاهَا فِي فَهْمِ وُجُوبِ الزَّكَاةِ أو أحدها لم يرى نفسه محسنا إلا إلى نفسه إما ببذل ماله إظهارا لحب الله تعالى أو تطهيرا لنفسه عن رذيلة البخل أو شكرا على نعمة المال طلبا للمزيد. So he says, as long as a person when giving zakat takes into consideration the three meanings that were given, which are number one, that zakah is obligatory. If I just quickly pull it up, just as the shahadatain is obligatory, and it is a fulfillment of the obligation of the shahadatain. How so? When we say ashhadu an la ilaha illallah wa ashhadu anna muhammadan rasulullah with our tongues, it is an indication of submission perhaps, but it's not an indication that Allah is most beloved to us than anything else. How do I show that? By sacrificing. And when I give zakah, I am sacrificing that which is most beloved to most people, money. Then he says المعنى الثاني التطهير من صفة البخل, to understand that zakah is a purification from the attribute of stinginess. So when I give zakah, I'm cleaning myself of stinginess. And we said stinginess and cowardice, they are the same. They come from the same place. Stinginess, al-bukhl, is the same as al-jubn, which is a person is afraid to submit their state to Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala either financially or physically. A person is afraid of danger, financially or physically. And so stinginess is a form of cowardice. And so if I notice that I'm stingy, there is a possibility that I'm also a coward. And so if I would like to remove cowardice from my heart, then I start by giving sadaqah whenever the opportunity arises. Doesn't mean I give everything, but I give as much as I can according to my state. And number three, في وقت الأداء, the third meaning, if I just find it, shukr ni'mah, that giving zakah is a form of showing Allah that we're grateful for the blessings that He's given us. And so when I give my zakah, I'm showing Allah my belief in Him and that I love Him more than anything else, and I'm ridding my heart of stinginess, and I am showing Allah that I'm grateful to Him for the blessings that He's given me. So he says, مهما عرف المعاني الثلاثة التي ذكرناها في فهم وجوب الزكاة أو أحدها لم يرى نفسه محسنا إلا إلى نفسه. As long as a person knows these three things when giving zakah, or at least one of them, he will not see himself as being good, doing a good thing to anyone except himself. It's like the person who takes medicine, he's not going to assume that he's doing good to others. He knows he's taking medicine for himself. He's only benefiting himself. Likewise, when I give zakah, I am only benefiting myself. He says, إِمَّا بِبَذْلِ مَالِهِ إِظْهَارًا لِحُبِّ اللَّهِ تَعَالَى, either through the sacrifice of his wealth for the sake of showing his love of Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala, أو تطهيرا لنفسه عن رذيلة البخل, or purifying himself from the low character or quality, as in a characteristic of miserliness, أو شكرا على نعمة المال طلبا للمزيد, or showing Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala his gratitude for the blessing that Allah has bestowed upon him of wealth, and in doing so he is seeking more from Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. Because when I give, I hope that Allah will give me more so that I can continue to give. And we said as well, when we look at the idea of al-riya, al-sum'a, etc., we should not only look at zakah. Imam Ghazali is going to speak about it later on when it comes to al-muhlikat, but we may never get there. And so if I am involved in public da'wah, if I'm involved in activism, if I'm involved in the masjid, if I worship a lot in public, I have to ask myself, am I doing it for the right reason? Because if I'm not, then it's a very dangerous position to be in. وصلى اللهم على سيدنا محمد.